Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here, even though here is remote and pre-recorded. I also want to acknowledge that I'm the uninvited guest on the Lekwungen and Wasanich People's Territory, and to pay tribute to the long-standing relationship that they have with the land that we work on and live on. So my name is Nancy Shackelford. I'm a relatively new assistant professor in the School of Environmental Studies, and I'm the academic director of the Restoration of Natural Systems program at UVic. And I've been asked to talk to you guys about ecosystem change and the things that drive and push ecosystem change. And it's a huge topic. And it is something I've been thinking about for most, but not all of my career. So I actually kind of wanted to start by introducing how I got to where I am in my thinking, and then from there kind of launch into the rest of the talk. So this is Austin, Texas. And as you can see, it's very, very green. I moved there when I was 18 years old, and I moved from the deserts of West Texas. I mean, typical tumbleweed, mesquite bushes, dirt. And moving into this landscape, I remember looking out over it and thinking to myself, wow, like this is nature, this is wild. And I felt so lucky to be there, and I was. However, as I started to learn about ecology and learn about ecosystems as my degree progressed, I really started to view this landscape very differently. So by my third or fourth year, I was volunteering in a research lab, and I was learning that this whole landscape used to be what was called the Blackland Prairie. So it was tall grass prairie, it was highly productive, it was highly diverse. All of the old texts about it talk about the grasses brushing the stomach of the horses as they walked through. And as it goes, as land use changed, highway went over it, so most of the Blackland Prairie has been converted into Interstate Highway 35. And big chunks of it turned into what you see here, which is woodland. It's juniper woodland. So this is a native species that you see. However, this is a huge change over a couple of hundred years. And as you learn about these things, you can't unsee it. I don't look at this landscape anymore and think, how wild is it? It is wild, it is natural, there's a lot of valuable things here. But it also represents a massive amount of change that humans have really caused in the past couple of hundred years. And you just can't unknow that kind of thing. So I wanted to address this talk in two different sections. The first, probably a lot of things that you guys already know. What are the main common drivers of ecosystem change, and what can we do about them? What do the ecologists and managers of the world have as coping techniques for some of these changes? The next part of the talk I wanted to be more positive, to think about what are the positive changes that humans are bringing into the landscapes now, and what are some of the more complex and advanced management tools that we've developed to think about all these different layered forces. So the first part of the talk is definitely going to be a bit of a list, but that's because there is a list of ecosystem changes. So habitat loss, I think, is one of the most obvious, and it's definitely one of the largest threats to habitat globally. So this image is actually about 10 years in Central America. I nabbed it from the BBC. And you can see the changes. It's so obvious when a patch of forest is cleared that it is a fundamentally different ecosystem. It is performing a different function on the landscape, and it has lost a lot of the original species and habitat characteristics that we would think of. So that's kind of this really obvious thing. What's also kind of obvious is what it's doing to the mosaic of the landscape. Each little remnant gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that in and of itself drives a lot of changes within each of the remnants. So larger remnants can generally house more species. They can house more ecosystem functions. And so as these things shrink, you're much more likely to start to lose some of those ecological values that you might have for that landscape. Additionally, things like fragmentation and isolation can lead to species loss and no way to bring them back. So if you have a highly connected landscape, species can jump from spot to spot. But when you start to have these fragmented long distances between patches, that kind of connectivity is much harder to have on the landscape. And this feels to me very much almost too big to consider as a manager. But actually we've come up with tools and techniques that at least consider this kind of landscape scale idea. So if you think about projects like the Yellowstone to Yukon project, it's a giant effort to try and connect up two really big existing remnants. So they're trying to gather up and restore little pockets that allow like stepping stones from these two, what would have been traditionally connected landscapes. Same for the Gondwana Link project in Australia, which is starting to stretch from the coastline all the way up into the arid parts of Western Australia. And they've been buying up abandoned agricultural land for the last 20 years, restoring it and trying to link all of those different kinds of ecosystems. So there's a lot of strategic ways to start to think about the landscape. But a lot of us can't go out and just buy a bunch of property. So there are other things that you can do. And I think, in particular, Saanich Peninsula is quite good about educating their community on if you have landowners who are willing to put little habitat pieces within their land, that in and of itself can bring connectivity into the landscape. It can enhance the ability of species to move through that mosaic of land uses. And so I think we are, as an organizational mindset, thinking about these landscape scales and how we can manage them effectively. However, even at the site level, these kinds of landscape changes have clear implications for the way that ecosystems will behave. So this is Saanich Peninsula. I actually live in the middle of this picture. And you can see that it's a very complex mosaic of land uses. There's agriculture, there's urban, there's suburban, and there's natural areas. And one of my favorite parks is embedded in this landscape. Gore Nature Park is a really beautiful little hidden gem with a gorgeous Garry Oak Meadow patch in it. You'll hear me talk a lot about Garry Oak Meadows in this talk. And it's also got some nice coastal Doug fir forest. And it's just kind of hidden amongst the Brentwood, suburbia kind of area. But from this, you can tell that it's actually fairly isolated. To the north, it's got urban built up. To the south, it's suburban built up. To the west, it's urban and then ocean. And then to the east, it's agriculture. And so you don't have this movement through the landscape of any species that are located within that patch. And if you kind of zoom in, you can also see that this kind of fragmentation has led to edges. And edges are really important when we start thinking about ecosystem changes because they become this interface for change. So first of all, the climate of that edge can actually change pretty fundamentally. So if you look at this image, this is actually taken along that roadside, you can see it transitions really rapidly from forest to grass. And so in these areas, you'll have higher winds, you'll have higher temperatures, you'll have lower moisture because things will evaporate much more quickly. You also have more interface with humans. So you can't really see it in this picture, but there was an area where the neighbors had obviously come in and just harvested a little bit of some of the local populations. So you have this kind of location on the site that allows influences to start to creep in. And this interface can actually be managed in and of itself. You can soften some of those boundaries. Instead of having that tree to grass, this could be hedgerows and have sort of a transition from one ecosystem to the next. You can make sure that if there is something like invasive species pool or management, they sort of start on the edge and work their way in. And so that allows you to use this interface to the advantage of the ecosystem itself. And though you can't see it in this picture per se, it really is an interface for invasive species and becomes one of the most vulnerable parts for new species to come in. So this was covered in blackberry, it was covered in Daphne, it was covered in all those really noxious plants that we think about. And those in and of themselves are one of the largest and most obvious drivers of ecosystem change. And they're one of the ones that actually community members seem to be the most concerned about. Particularly in the Saanich area, there are a lot of people who really love to pull weeds. So there seems to be a lot of community awareness around invasive species. There's a huge variety of invasive species though. So this is just a couple from BC, and you can see they range from invertebrates to plants to vertebrates, marine, freshwater. I particularly think the goldfish is an interesting example. It looks so cute and innocuous. And actually the way that it gets into our streams is that neighbors will decide that they want to set their little goldfish free. And these things, once they're released in the wild, can grow up to 40 pounds. They can produce 40,000 eggs in a single year. And the way that they forage is they dig around in the sediment and pull up plants and disturb the sediment. So they're huge drivers of potential ecosystem change in the freshwater systems that we have. And so I think that to me is one of the key things that we have to think about with invasive species. There are so many exotics in these landscapes. There are so many problems to deal with that we really need to start targeting. And we do, I think, a good job of targeting those species that have the most impact, that cause the largest changes. And I think invasive species are also a really interesting way to engage the community because they do have that willingness to come and pull weeds, to come and deal with invasive species. It's a nice way to pull them into the management process and to kind of leverage one of these potential drivers of negative change for one of the potential drivers of positive change, which is increased stewardship and connection amongst the people that are living and working around these areas. It is a more complex story than that, though. This is obviously a daffodil, which is not technically invasive. It's pretty slow to reproduce. It's pretty slow to expand its own range. However, I did want to bring it up because to me it highlights this interface between humans and between the community and their stewardship of their environment and some of the less desirable ecological outcomes. So I did some of my PhD work in Peacock Park, and I had never gone onto one side of the park because it was sort of out of the purview of my surveys. And because of COVID, I was taking all of these walks with friends, and we walked up into the park from one side that I hadn't been in, and we saw like a hillside of daffodils. And there was a little sign beside those daffodils that said, "These are planted and tended for the enjoyment of the community. Please don't pluck the daffodils." And there's actually evidence that people are going into parks and planting daffodils. You can find them in pretty dense swaths in other parts of the peninsula that are nearby there. And so even though in and of themselves they're biologically not going to act like an invasive species, because of this human connection to how pretty they are and how much we like them in the spring, they do have the potential to change an ecosystem, to change one of the rural or urban parks that we're working in. And so I think that level of community connection, understanding what people see in parks and how that influences the way that they behave in those parks, is one of the more important things that we can do as managers, and to understand what changes we're likely to see. Because the more daffodils are planted, the less space there is for the native components that we might want in that park. And so I think there's an ongoing conversation as we think about species that might or might not be good for an ecosystem and how we leverage the community to control those, also discussing with the community what they want to see and how that impacts the other goals that they might have. I think this also leads into another sort of sticky problem, which is the idea of a native invader. So a native invader actually has a technical definition, which is that if a native species is released from a particular population pressure and is able to expand really rapidly, then it's considered a potential native invader. And snowberry is a sort of unofficially acknowledged native invader because it will move fairly rapidly into things like Garry Oak Meadows, so things with open understories, and it will reproduce really rapidly and turn into relatively dense thickets. And those thickets make it really hard for the other species that we're interested in to potentially recruit and survive in that area. They fundamentally can change the structure of an ecosystem. But it's really interesting to talk about things like controlling this process with people who aren't used to thinking about the ecosystem as a whole. So here on the UVic campus, we have been talking with facilities management about restoring one of the meadows that we have on campus. And we had a really interesting conversation where they were so enthusiastic and so excited about all of our plans to remove the daphne, to remove the blackberry. And we got to the stage where we mentioned we wanted to remove the snowberry, which has actually encroached on some of the listed species. And the immediate reaction was, oh, but it's a native. And so there's, again, one of those conversations that you have to have around why you would control a native species. Why would you take a native species out of the landscape? And what does that mean for the goals of the project? So a lot of this dealing with ecosystem change really is centered around how we define the goals for a particular site, for a particular management action. And once we've defined those goals, clearly understanding what actions need to be taken to meet those goals. And so in some instances, it might be pulling out a native species, but we have to be clear about the reasons why, about the methods that we're going to use, and about the limitations. Maybe we'll leave it in other places. So for instance, there's a ton of snowberry all over the rest of campus. So some of these things are an ongoing conversation with other stakeholders that are involved. So there has been a theme when I've talked about native invasion, which is that the two species I've mentioned, snowberry and juniper, in my original Texas example, have been released from historical fire disturbances. So it's been widely acknowledged now that humans have been managing the landscape for a very, very long time. And part of those management practices have involved disturbances. So here on the coastline, there was fire management to keep open understories and to promote the growth of things like camas, which are food. In Texas, for instance, there was a lot of lightning strikes, which have all been controlled because of the urban and rural building up. And the loss of these kinds of disturbances also lead to some really fundamental changes in the ecosystem. So for instance, woody invasion in response to loss of fire is really common. It's a global problem. There are other disturbances that have been lost. So root gardens are a really good example of management that went in and sort of dug around and really disturbed the soil profile. And that action in and of itself acts to change the way that the ecosystem develops and evolves. And so the loss of those relationships that we have between the human management actions that can be a disturbance on the landscape and how the ecosystem has evolved to meet those has led to changes that we see in our ecosystems now. And I think there's some discussion around how to bring those components back into the landscape. One is just to reintroduce them. So this is Tumbo Island. It's about halfway between Vancouver and Victoria. And this is an image of the fire that they reintroduced in 2016. So it was a partnership between Parks Canada and a number of First Nations communities. And they went out at the right time of year, according to historical knowledge and according to the local fire chiefs, and put a prescribed burn into a Garry Oak meadow with the goal of tracking how it impacts the ecosystem. And this is more of a complex topic, I think, than it first seems. Initially, you want to say, we've reintroduced fire, we've done a good thing. However, fire behaves very differently depending on what's there. So for instance, the understory was much thicker than it would have been historically. The plant composition was much different. Now we have a lot of non-native invasive grasses that create a lot of biomass, which burns really well. And so because the dynamics of the fire have probably changed based on these already existing ecosystem changes, just reintroducing it might not actually be achieving the same kinds of results that we're looking for. So there are other alternatives. For instance, I spoke to somebody up in Cowichan, and his favorite version of a fire is actually in the shape of a goat. So he introduces goats at just the right time of year, on just the right parcel of land to get what he thinks to be the effects of the fire that would have been there before. So I think we are coming up with creative tools to think about what these historical disturbance regimes and management regimes would have meant for the landscape, and how do we imitate that in a brand new landscape. Because there's also a lot of social pushback against some disturbances. So for instance, fire. I'm sure many of you have experienced the increases in megafires, maybe not in person, but you've seen it in the media. You've seen smoke that's covered BC over summers because climate change is leading to more frequent extreme events, more megafires, larger fires, and there's just becoming this fear of the fire event in and of itself, and that plays into whether or not we're able to even think about fire as a management tool. And so not only are we having to think about those social dimensions for any disturbance that we want to put into a landscape, but we also have to think about the fact that landscapes will be undergoing more and more extreme events. That is kind of the one known about climate change, is that extreme events are going to become more frequent. And so as we're planning for the landscapes that we're working in, there needs to be some contingency plans, understanding what are the extreme events that are likely to occur and what are the actions that would need to be taken immediately after that would help the recovery process, that would push the ecosystem back onto the trajectory that it would need to be to recover from that extreme event. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Everyone knows that the climate is changing. Well, I assume most people believe the climate is changing, and I know that Richard Hebda is going to give a whole talk on it. So this is just to show that the trends are definitely clear, extreme events are occurring more, but I wanted to kind of narrow in on what's happening here in British Columbia specifically, because this is one of those global forces and regional forces that we have to think about when we're planning out our ecosystem management. So BC has experienced warming trends already. It's expected to exceed 3 degrees by 2100, which is a lot. There's already been evidence of wetter, milder winters, reduced snowpack, sea level rise. Sea level rise has actually led to some really tragic impacts to things like burial cairns on the coastline from traditional First Nations. There's drier summers that are happening all over BC, but particularly in the south. And again, that increased extreme frequency. And these are the kinds of things that we have to think about if we're planning out our landscape management, because one of the ways to deal with these changes might be to explicitly put in components of the ecosystem that might better handle drier summers, or to plan the landscape to be really heterogeneous. Maybe you have areas that are wetter, and so that's where you can put species that need that kind of wetness. Maybe you have areas that are kind of on the interface, and you can start introducing drier and drier species under the assumption that that's how the ecosystem is going to change. So really leveraging aspects of the landscape that are conducive to including diversity, including heterogeneity, can help buffer against some of these long-term changes that we might not be able to predict what they're going to do in the landscape. Demographic changes are usually considered an indirect effect, but I actually think, given how directly they link to habitat loss, that I would consider them more of a direct effect. So I did want to mention that demographic changes are extremely important when we think about ecosystem management, and they're extremely important when you just think about the land use that surrounds whatever area you're working in. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Victoria, but at the moment it's about 386,000. It's estimated to surpass 440,000 in the next 15 years. That's a pretty big increase, and most of that is concentrated in one location, which is Langford, so the western suburbs. So this is also where we've seen the most land conversion in the last 10 years. It's also where we have some of the biggest patches of potential natural area that could be lost to land conversion. So those communities are going to grow the fastest. And so if you're working in those regions, understanding how the land use might change, where you might have increased threats from the addition of impermeable landscape. So if a condo goes up right next to your park, that's going to be totally different than if there was an agricultural field. So understanding how those demographic changes are going to change the surrounding landscape can really help you plan out what are the upcoming threats that I need to understand and plan for when I'm looking at my park or my ecosystem. Okay, so now I want to talk about the happy stuff. These are my students at Galiano Island. They're the most amazing. I think I, as a restoration ecologist, feel sort of obliged to be hopeful, and I am hopeful because restoration is an inherently hopeful action. So this is an enthusiastic group of students who are working on a very degraded part of Galiano Island within the Galiano Conservancy. They are digging up non-native grasses so that they can plant upland native species, and then in the next few months they're going to dig out a trench to install a wetlands, put in a liner, fill it with water, and plant a bunch of native wetland species. And this will be used as an educational tool. They bring kids out to this site all the time. And so you see this interaction between the restoration itself and the education and engagement of the public. And that's really what restoration is about. It's about that interface between humans and the environment. And I think that's where we get our most positive forces within these ecosystems. Most of our ecosystems are degraded in some way, and most people want to be helpful and steward those so that they look better and have more ecological values embedded in them. So restoration has kind of one really giant international organization that has recently released some standards. It's the Society of Ecological Restoration International, and you'll find some people that love the standards, some people that don't so much love the standards. But I did want to show the principles underpinning and highlight a few that I think are really keystone in understanding kind of the spirit of restoration and the role that it plays on the landscape. So the first is really about that interface with people. It's about engaging stakeholders. It's about making sure that the community is involved, because it's been shown time and again scientifically that if restoration ignores or doesn't engage the community, it is much more likely to fail. There's a really neat study well, it's not neat, but there was a study in Costa Rica that showed that restoration that ignored potential land uses in the next 10 years by not engaging landowners and their children saw much higher rates of restored forests being cut down and converted. So it's that engagement process, discussing with this current generation and the next generation what they envision for that landscape and what the restoration means to them and can provide for them, that really can help our restoration persist. And it also draws on many types of knowledge. I think this is a rising understanding in restoration, which is that humans have been in this landscape for a very long time, And ignoring that does not lead to the successful outcomes that we're really aiming for. And so bringing in multiple types of knowledge, multiple types of stakeholders, people that have been on the landscape either for millennia or for hundreds of years. So I had a really neat interaction with a bunch of rangeland managers. They've owned and operated their rangeland with their cows for 4 generations, and they knew more about that ecosystem than any scientist that I know that had worked there. So being able to engage all those different kinds of knowledge is really what supports the idea of restoration and the foundations of restoration. I also wanted to talk a little bit about this particular principle, the native reference ecosystem. This has been a funny point of contention in restoration for a very long time. Well, it's actually only 30 years old as a field, so not that long. But the principle here, if you read it carefully, says it's informed by native reference ecosystems. And I think that's becoming the theme, is that we really can't go back to a particular historical point. We also can't go to a contemporary point next door because the land use history between 2 sites is totally different. The community engagement between 2 sites is totally different. The priority of, so when species arrived and which species came, which invasive species are there, which native species are there, totally different. So it's less about having a particular target ecosystem and more about having a holistic perspective on the goals and values that you want to get out of an ecosystem and provide for the ecosystem. And so it's a combination. It's a combination of patches that are nearby that are kind of like what you envision. It's a combination of historical records. It's a combination of local knowledge. It's a combination of community and stakeholder goals for the site. And bringing those together into a complex but hopeful plan for an individual site. And the last thing that I really wanted to highlight out of these is that it's part of a continuum of restorative activities. I think this is, for me, this is a very interesting one. I think it's because, so the Society of Ecological Restoration has quite a clear idea of what they think restoration is, whereas I've dealt with so many different people doing different versions of restoration. I just spent an entire afternoon with the Friends of North Saanich, and they go in almost daily and pull weeds out of the parks that they're working in, and they've cleared English ivy and Daphne lorelei out of entire parks. And this to me is a clear restoration action. However, they're not adding in ecological components. They don't have this whole process of stakeholder engagement and clear goals and objectives. And so for me, it's not on a continuum, it is restoration. And so I think what I am a proponent of, and what maybe doesn't fit entirely with the newest standards, is that restoration is an action of caretaking, it's an action of stewardship. And how we define what is and isn't restoration really, to me, rests with the intent and activities of the people that are in the landscape doing the work. So given how many different kinds of ecosystem changes might be ongoing, I like to think of management as a risk analysis, and I like to think of risk analysis as being sort of spatially embedded. And so this, for me, is one of the first things that I do when I start thinking about a restoration project in particular, is I sit down and I list out what I think the biggest threats are and how we can mitigate them. And so there are global scale factors that need to be considered. So climate considerations. In the prairies that I've worked in previously, it's really clear that it's getting drier. How do we take that into consideration when we plan species additions, for instance? Are there extreme events that may occur? And how can you put species in that are able to handle and deal with and recover from those extreme events? How do you buffer? So for instance, if you know flooding is going to be more common, how can you design your park in order to consider buffering from flooding events, or putting long pathways between the water itself and the ecosystem that might not be able to handle that flooding event? And what are the population projections and how will they impact the site? So this goes back to, how do you think the landscape around is going to change, and what does that mean? Is it going to increase impermeable cover? Is that going to cause runoff issues for your site? And how do you consider those when you start to plan out your management? Bring that in, and we're looking at landscape scale factors. So our land use is likely to change. What is the landscape context? So is there connectivity that you can take advantage of? So are there parks that are nearby? Can you go into those parks and see what species are there? Can you understand what that landscape looks like and what it means for your site? Are there neighbors that are willing to put in pollinator habitat so you get movement of pollinators between the patches? Are there imminent landscape threats? And also, are there policy or regulatory issues that should be considered? So for instance, lots of funding is available in BC because of the Species at Risk Act. So in Garry Oak Meadows, a lot of the restoration is funded through SARA, effectively. There's habitat conservation, pools of money that can support, there's mitigation, regulation that can support restoration, and all of these things can play into not only how you fund, but also think about the restoration that you're doing. Bringing it down again to site scale factors, are there invasive species? So site surveys are incredibly important to do before you start making your management plan. You have to know what's on your site to understand not only the threats, but also the opportunities that exist, the strengths and the weaknesses. And so going out and mapping those should be step one in anybody's planning design. So what invasive species are there? What vulnerable species are there? What highly cultural valuable species are there? And how can you support those throughout the community as you start to manage it? And how does the surrounding community use look like? Do they bring their dogs in all the time? Does that mean that you need to be planning for dogs off leash, on leash? Are there desire trails that you need to consider? So bringing all of those to the site level can kind of help you crystallize what are the opportunities and the threats that exist in the site. And then you can even look at a smaller subsite. So again, it's that building of heterogeneity, understanding what each aspect of the site can bring, what the vulnerabilities and opportunities are within each of those aspects of the site, and planning spatially explicit. Make sure that you're not planning over the entire site, but rather tailoring each of your management actions to the portions of the site that it's most appropriate. And there are some really cool planning tools that allow you to do this through software or through some quite structured way. And I wanted to introduce one because I've just recently learned about it. I quite like it. I find it very interesting. So it's called Merati, and it's a conservation measures partnership and Sitka Technology Group. It's not exactly free, but it's quite cheap and available online. And so they partnered together and created this way to visualize management actions and how they impact conservation goals. So this is one of the examples they use in all their tutorials. I find it very intuitive and I really like it. So thought I would present it, which is if you think about islands where you have seabird populations, because of rat invasion, seabirds are often at risk because of predation on seabird nests. So this seems like a really simple, straightforward way to think about the ecosystem. So obviously you would manage rats, that would decrease predation, and then suddenly you have more seabirds. But Merati really challenges you to go backwards from each potential threat. So actually, it's not that the rats invaded once, it's that they continually are reintroduced on tourist boats. So even if you extirpated them, even if you got rid of all of them on the island, within a couple of weeks, they'll probably come back from the tourist boats. So this really shows you where your leverage points are. So maybe it's not immediately dealing with the invasion itself, maybe it's dealing with the tourist boats. So you can put rat barriers on tourist boats, which would, in theory, stop new rat access and allow you to eliminate rats and decrease predation. So again, this tool really lets you think through these processes. And I think it's really important when we're managing sites, especially complex or larger sites, that we go through this thought process. And I know the CRD is actually starting to implement it more and more in their parks. It was introduced to me by a student working for them at Woody's Lagoon, actually. And it takes it a step further. So, okay, rat barriers, how do we get rat barriers on the boats? So we support green tours, so eco tours, and maybe they will willingly put rat barriers. Or we go to the government and we look at policy and actions. And it goes even further for individual actions that you can take. So you can educate ministry officials, for instance, and then it guides you through each of the steps that action would have to achieve the goal. So I do really recommend that if you are doing a management plan, if you're thinking about doing a management plan even, or if you're working in a really large site where there's lots of different threats, lots of different potential conservation goals, this forces you to set out those goals clearly and then to map out what that site dynamic looks like and how to manage it. So I do recommend this. It's quite a neat tool. There's also adaptive management, which I know that we all hear a lot. I think there's not a clear understanding of what adaptive management actually is. Originally, in the scientific literature, it was this idea that we should all go out and implement perfectly replicated, perfectly controlled experiments in our management landscape and then use the resulting knowledge to design another perfectly replicated, perfectly controlled experiment. And from there, learn how to best manage. However, I don't know a single manager who is able to devote that much time and resource and space to perfectly developed and designed experiments. So adaptive management is now much more of an umbrella term, but it does involve that deliberate testing of multiple kinds of management actions. So this is Moralee's meadow in Metchosin, and standing around chatting and staring at the ground are a lot of restoration ecologists, some students, myself, I was brand new to BC at the time. And what they're looking at is 2 students went out and didn't know how to control the invasive grasses, didn't have a good idea of how to bring species back, so they just started trialing things. They put black plastic to smother plants down in the late summer, and then they tried putting it in the fall, and then they tried putting it after a rain, and then they tried compression, and then they tried mulch, and then they took it all off at the same time and tracked through the next season what came back. Did it actually effectively control the invasive species? Did it not? And they learned some really cool stuff that they were then able to pass on to the community partner. And so those stewards that are still working in Moralee's meadow have a lot more knowledge to build off of. This wasn't a replicated experiment. It wasn't perfectly designed or quantitatively measured at each time point, and yet it represents an active learning process and the ability to flexibly move your management around to incorporate that learning. And so that is what adaptive management looks like often on the landscape scale, is being able to change your management strategies based on knowledge that you deliberately collect. That deliberate collection is part of it as well. To do adaptive management in a really useful way, you really need monitoring in place. The monitoring can look like any number of things, but it does need to be regularly checking in on the outcomes and doing it in a way that's methodical and repeated and consistent, because that's really how you collect the kinds of information, especially in ecosystems that are super variable, from year to year are probably experiencing pretty big changes. That kind of consistent monitoring will be the best guide that you have to which adaptive management techniques you should be taking. Despite all of this, I still think we have to understand and view certain kinds of changes as less desirable than other kinds of changes. And Eric Higgs is going to give a talk on novel ecosystems, and so I'm not going to go in depth, but I did want to give this example of how ecosystem change maybe isn't the big bad that we all need to worry about. This is a picture of a eucalypt forest. So eucalypts are generally an Australian species. This is the blue gum, which is mostly found on Tasmania. And this beautiful cod forest is found in San Francisco. It's called Mount Sutro. And it's been there for hundreds of years and is beloved by the community. It's surrounded on all sides by San Francisco, so the eucalypt spread is minimal. And there's been a long conversation around whether or not to leave the eucalypts or to take them out to put native vegetation in. And the native vegetation in this particular area would probably be more scrubby and much drier, whereas these trees tend to collect all of the fog that rolls through San Francisco, and so creates a really special and unique habitat. And so this represents a novel ecosystem in that it is, if no other threshold is there, it is that the community is attached to it and refuses to see fundamental changes shift this back to a fully native ecosystem. And whether or not that's bad, I think is up for debate, and has been debated repeatedly. But I think that we, when we're dealing with the changes that we see in our own ecosystems, really need to sit and assess. So again, it's all about that specifying of your goals, clearly understanding what your aims are for a particular site or a particular action, and understanding whether or not certain ecosystem changes are counter to that, or whether or not they're supportive for that, or whether or not they're just sort of neutral. And so rather than really fearing those changes just inherently, understanding how they are situated within the larger context, I think, is really important. And that's one of the things that, honestly, you have to think about when you look at the Texas landscape. This juniper woodland is much less diverse. It doesn't have any of the herbaceous species that would have been in the Blackline Prairie. The Blackline Prairie is mostly gone, and that's really tragic. But these also are it's some of the largest patches of habitat for the endangered species, the golden cheek warbler. And so taking out the juniper can be really detrimental to this really threatened, high conservation valuable species. And so being able to see the nuances of how change has led to more change, and some of them are good and some of them might not be, I think those are the kinds of conversations that we all have to have together. So thanks for your time and enjoy the rest of your course.